It's 5 o'clock in London, it's 6 p.m. in Warsaw, where I am this evening, midday in New York, midnight in Hong Kong, 2 a.m. in Sydney, 9 a.m. in San Francisco, and 9:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. My name is Patrick L. Young, the IPO-VID livestream, Series 31, Episode 3. We're back after our summer holidays for Episode 133 starts here. Well, what can I say about things that have been happening in the parish of exchanges? Lots going on during the course of our summer break. Free fish tends to suggest a product close to sell-by date, but the London Stock Exchange says Pisces is so good they can give it away. That doesn't seem to me to be anything but a half-baked solution. Over at the NSE, the National Stock Exchange of India, they appointed him as a director just last week. They now have a chairman, Srinivas Injeti. He is a really five-star all-round serious regulatory figure. What's the message we're getting out of that? All eyes are fixed on the prize, the one that we've been waiting for a generation, ladies and gentlemen, the IPO of the National Stock Exchange of India. Watch this space. Over in Zagreb in Croatia, FINA, that's not the Belgian petrol company. FINA is a government-owned agency which holds various things, including the CSD, the settlement depository of the Croatian stock market. They are advancing their takeover bid for the Zagreb Stock Exchange itself, which is listed on its own exchange, with a regulatory green light coming through from the Croatian regulators, shockingly enough. So one arm of the government says another arm of the government can buy the Zagreb Stock Exchange. Interesting times. Look forward to a very exciting Central Eastern, Southeastern European unified silo coming soon. Our guest today, ladies and gentlemen, is Dan Mitchell. The topic from Washington, D.C. to Argentina. Dan Mitchell is an economist. He's chairman of the Center for Freedom and Prosperity. We're on board with those goals. A pro-market public policy organization he founded in 2000 AD. His major research interests include tax reform, international tax competition, the economic burden of government spending, and other fiscal policies issues. Having also worked at the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute, therefore he's got a blue-blooded free market reputation across Washington, D.C. Dan has decades of experience authoring papers, writing editorials, working with the public policy community, and presenting the free market viewpoint to newspapers, televisions, and radio media. And you can guess within that bio, ladies and gentlemen, why we've invited him here today. So, George, without further ado, you are a man of many fantastic, wonderful, and interesting parts. Let me ask, where in the world are you today? Welcome to the show.
I'm sitting at home in Virginia. I just got back a couple of days ago from Mexico. I leave on Sunday for Spain, but for right now, I'm actually touching base here in Fairfax, Virginia.
Fairfax, Virginia. That's fabulous. And so tell me a little bit, where actually do you originally come from, Dan?
Originally from the Connecticut, New York area, basically the suburbs of New York City, then went down to Georgia for school, and I've been in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. now for 40 years.
Wow, 40 years. So tell us a bit about that. How did you come to be involved in the public policy apparatus?
I guess the credit goes to Ronald Reagan. When I was young, for whatever reason, and my family wasn't political, but following the news, I saw this guy Reagan running for president, and he was saying things that just made sense to me. So I went off to college and originally majored in political science, but then I figured out what I was really interested in was economics. And then when I went up to George Mason University for the PhD program in economics, I've been in the Northern Virginia, D.C. area ever since, doing think tank work, trying to educate audiences on the importance of limited government and free markets. And unfortunately, the most remedial audience of all are the politicians in Washington, D.C. So that's always been a tough sell.
Well, it's always been a tough sell in Washington, D.C., but on the other hand, it has to be said, they look to be pretty progressive compared to some of the people you could find in, for example, Brussels. But at the same time, I can fully appreciate that it's a difficult message to come across. Also, fascinating news today. I don't know if you noticed it, but apparently Fawn Hall has married Colonel Oliver North. There's something that really gives us a retro 1980s feel, ladies and gentlemen. So tell me, these days, therefore, what are you getting up to? What sort of things are really interesting you in this exciting new, not Reaganite, but MAGA era of Washington, D.C.?
Well, Trumpism is not Reaganism. In some areas, they do overlap. Trump is a deregulator. and he's a tax cutter. So you could say those things match up with the Reagan agenda, or for that matter, the Reagan-Thatcher agenda, since we have an international audience here. But on issues such as trade and government spending, I'm afraid Trump's more of a populist, not a free market conservative. He's definitely very, very bad on trade. I'm sure everyone in your audience knows that he's just a big protectionist. But what really worries me, since I'm a fiscal policy guy, is that he is not taking seriously the growing burden of government spending. And when you look at the combination of aging population, falling birth rates, and poorly designed entitlement programs, the United States, and by the way, not just the United States, so many of the world's rich countries in Europe, North America, Pacific Rim, we're facing the likelihood of a very serious fiscal crisis. And whether that happens in 5 months or 5 years or 15 years, I have no idea. But if we don't change direction, it's going to be an economic nightmare.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, isn't it? Because obviously, I mean, what is it? It's Tuesday, so we're into our second French government of the week. And I mean, in Europe, obviously, it's much more acute. But nonetheless, I mean, America is at the point where it's spending a colossal amount of money that isn't really there in terms of how it can manage to easily raise it.
Yeah, the burden of government spending in the United States is not as high as it is in Europe, and that's to our advantage. We're not as far down the path. I wouldn't even call it down the path to socialism, because it's really just redistributionism. I mean, socialism technically is government ownership of the means of production, central planning, price controls, the whole sort of Soviet Union retro approach. And by and large, most left-wingers today aren't pushing those policies, but they are pushing policies of just endless redistribution financed by endless class warfare taxes. And Margaret Thatcher said it right many decades ago. The problem with that approach is that sooner or later, you run out of other people's money. And you look at what's happening to interest rates on long-run government bonds. I think the market is getting increasingly nervous. And by the way, look at the fundamentals in Europe today compared to, say, 15 years ago, when there was last a fiscal crisis. Government debt levels are higher, government spending levels are higher, demographics are worse. I would be very, very nervous if I was holding a big pile of Italian or British or Spanish or French government debt.
Yes, it's quite incredible at the moment. And I mean, the French issue really raised something, because certainly this week we've seen a French government fall because they wanted to get rid of 2 days holiday. But actually, the French are already taking, I think, 35 or 40% more holiday than the United States of America. And they're actually less productive when they're in the office, which is a big turnaround from where they were in the 1960s and 70s, where they were amongst the most productive people in the world alongside the Germans. And those are the sorts of things that people, certainly in Europe, I think things are running out of steam. Thank heavens for the Polish constitution, which at least in theory limits debt to GDP to 60% of the government spending, which is a wonderful thing, and far too late to impose that in most of the rest of the advanced world.
Well, and an even better approach is what you have in Switzerland. Voters in 2001 approved a referendum that imposed a spending cap. It's technically called the debt brake, but what it basically does is it says that government spending on sort of a rolling 5-year basis is limited to the growth of the economy. And ever since the Swiss spending cap debt brake went into effect, government debt levels have fallen. The burden of government spending as a share of GDP has declined. Switzerland keeps getting richer, while the rest of the continent keeps falling behind. So I actually think Switzerland is really the best role model in Europe for good fiscal policy.
I think that's a very good point and well made. And certainly you look at Europe, where essentially, what is it? I mean, over the course of the last 15 years, you've seen the US economy growing by something like 89%, and the European economy overall has managed to grow by something like 9%. It would be a colossal meeting of minds just to manage to find them trying to think about economic growth, because they haven't broken 2% for 60 quarters or something like that, if not more. It's really a mess. So, I mean, when you look at, and when you're talking to people, obviously, you mentioned the fact that you're off to Spain in the near future. You've just been in Mexico. Are there any governments across the world that you're finding particularly receptive to a kind of Reaganite free trade and deregulatory message?
Far and away, the most exciting news in the world today in terms of economic policy, or should I say the good news, because that's very rare, and that's in Argentina. Javier Milei, after winning a surprise landslide victory in November 2023, has just done some great reforms in terms of reducing the burden of government spending, deregulating, making all sorts of positive changes that have begun to turn Argentina around after 70 plus years of bad Peronist policy that was basically protectionism, big spending, class warfare, heavy-handed state regulation. So there's 70 to 80 years of mistakes that Javier Milei is now trying to undo in Argentina. He's off to a great start, but there's still a lot to be done.
Well, there's obviously a colossal amount to be done because you look at the Argentine economy, as you say, I mean, when the Peronistas were on the rise, just after the Second World War, Argentina was the 6th or 7th biggest economy in the world. Okay, a few guys had kind of relegated themselves through being defeated, but even so, it was obviously a G10, if there had been such a thing at that stage, economy without a doubt. And yet 70 years of misgovernment and they ended up essentially almost in the little leagues. It's quite staggering. So what do you think are the best things that Milei has achieved so far?
What I'm very impressed with is that when he got into office, government spending was eating up 38% of the Argentinian economy. Within 1 year, he reduced the burden of government spending to 32% of GDP, the largest single peacetime fiscal consolidation in world history. And it was 100% on the spending side of the ledger because, of course, the reason countries get in trouble is not because they don't tax enough, it's because they spend too much. So Javier Milei has done a great job in just 1 year in terms of controlling government spending. And because he controlled government spending, he immediately balanced the budget, something nobody thought could be done. And because he balanced the budget, there was no longer a need for the Argentinian central bank to print money to finance their deficits. So inflation has come down from over 200% to, now it's less than 20%, and it's on its way down to basically nothing. So he's doing exactly what libertarians have always said would be necessary to make an economy stronger, and he's getting exactly the results libertarians said you would get. Now, I don't want to say Argentina is out of the woods, because not only was there 70 plus years of bad government policy, but the Congress, the legislature down in Argentina is still controlled by the Peronists. And so if Milei is going to have a chance to do other things that are necessary to achieve his goal of making Argentina the world's freest economy, they really need to have some good results in the October 26th midterm elections. And unfortunately, just this past weekend in the province of Buenos Aires, the Peronists did better than expected. So, I don't think Argentina is out of the woods. The question is, do the people understand the danger, the damage, the mess that the Peronists made, and are they willing to give Javier Milei, in effect, a green light to do further reforms that are needed to restore that economy?
Well, it's interesting, you mentioned this Buenos Aires thing. Obviously, there's been a few scandals ticking along in the background and so on, but also, Buenos Aires is a Peronista stronghold. So, in some ways, when I looked at it, actually, I was surprised because the headlines told me how badly he'd done, but he actually got 37% of the vote. And I would have thought 3, 4, 5 years ago, nobody in their right mind would have ever believed that any sort of libertarian could manage to get 37% of the vote in Buenos Aires. So there does seem to be some change happening. But as you say, there are a lot of vested interests in and around the capital in particular who want Milei to fail.
There's no question that the Peronists would, and they're sometimes now called, the Kirchner crowd, but the left, more broadly speaking, they understand that Javier Milei is a threat to their way of life because the political establishment in Argentina was based on buying votes with other people's money. It was based on all sorts of special interest rules and regulations and trade barriers and a terribly complicated and punitive tax system, a bloated welfare state. And Milei is coming in and saying, look, that policy bankrupted us. That policy over several decades took us from one of the world's richest economies to being a at best, middle income economy, but, sort of heading dangerously in the direction of being another Venezuela. But, you have to ask the question, if you have a country where 70% of the people have been accustomed to government dependency, either welfare benefits, pension payments, disability payments, being a no-show employee in the government workforce, if Milei comes in and says, no, that can't work anymore, do you, as someone who's been a recipient of government largesse, do you understand that, well, I better vote for Milei because otherwise our economy will totally collapse? And the analogy I sometimes use is that if you're a flea or a tick and the dog that you're on dies, that's not good for you. So even the people who are mooching off the government should realize we have to back away from the trough. We have to let the private sector recover. We have to sort of remove the heavy burden, this giant wet blanket of statism off the Argentinian economy in order to get things going again. And then, of course, if you're a moocher, you can say, okay, now that the economy's going again, give me a slice. But at least you understand, if you vote for Milei, that you have to have some people in the private sector producing wealth before it can be redistributed.
Yes, and I think that's a very, very key point, because certainly the process of 70 years of the Peronista movement has been to gradually break down huge amounts of incentive for people at top and bottom to actually go out there and try and risk their money, because it simply became unworkable dealing with the plethora of officialdom and all of the other bureaucracy. And ultimately, the horrific thing, I mean, the last time I was in Buenos Aires was watching the influx of people, the reverse commuters who were all coming into the city on the sort of 4 and 5 o'clock trains when most people were trying to get out of town, and they were coming in to forage for cardboard or anything else that they could find that they could manage to sell as scrap. I mean, kind of useful for the circular economy, but a damning indictment of an actual functional marketplace.
I've been down to Argentina several times, twice earlier this year. I'll be down there again in November for the 1841 Foundation's annual conference. You can detect sort of a bit of a new energy, a new sort of vibrancy to the Argentinian economy. But again, I tell my libertarian friends in the US and elsewhere in the world, he's made a good start, but you don't undo 80 years of bad policy in just 18 months, especially with a Peronist legislature. So those October 26th elections really are key in terms of whether Argentina is going to truly have an economic renaissance and go back to being one of the world's richest countries, which by every possible metric in terms of natural resources, human capital, Argentina should be one of the richest countries in the world. But Milei needs to have the political support to make the additional reforms that are needed to clear out the deadwood of bad government policy that's just accumulated. It's like, I guess, to mix my metaphors, it's like, 70 plus years of barnacles building up on a ship. And Malay's been able to scrape off 1/5 of them. But a lot more needs to be scraped off for Argentina to become rich and give everyone in Argentina the chance to rise dramatically in terms of their living standards.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's that whole mentality gap, and also how long the kind of the overall apparatus of government takes to catch up. I mean, we saw that in the UK, where Mrs. Thatcher, I mean, her reforms were still effectively pushing the UK economy along 15, 20 years later when Tony Blair came back into government, and the Labour Party managed to start screwing everything up again and re-regulating the things that she had elegantly deregulated. So it's quite incredible to see the impact Milei has had so quickly. So tell me, I mean, I'm interested because obviously you're in Washington, D.C. most of the time. I appreciate you're in Virginia today, nearby. But what do you think is the actual attitude towards Milei? Because it seems at the top level, the president has a somewhat of a soft spot, or maybe J.D. Vance as well have a soft spot for Milei and his crusading activities. But actually their economics are overall quite different, as you were mentioning earlier.
I think what unites Milei and Trump is that they both are hated by the left. Now, the left hates them for different reasons, perhaps. The left hates Milei because he's threatening the whole sort of, insider crony system that Argentina had become. The left hates Trump simply because, I don't know, I guess mostly because he's politically incorrect, but also, to be fair to Trump, I mean, he's appointed good judges, he's deregulated, he's cut taxes. So there are policy reasons why the left hates Trump. And of course, they don't give him credit for the increases in government spending and the protectionism, even though those are left-wing policies. The left, if what they want is a true leftist imposing left-wing policies, they don't want a Republican doing it, or they're not going to give a Republican credit. So Milei and Trump, stylistically, they're the same, very sort of, over-the-top personalities, very flamboyant, very aggressive in terms of going after their enemies. In the case of Malay, the enemy is the casta, the political caste. In the case of Trump, it's just anyone who gets crosswise with them, I guess. And they do have some similarities in terms of government policy. But again, there are those big differences on sort of government spending and trade, where Trump is more of a big government populist, whereas Malay is an across-the-board libertarian.
Very interesting. So, I mean, let me ask you, in terms of what's going on in the US at the moment, obviously we've got, what now? I mean, little more than 12 months, actually, 14 months to the midterms, something like that. Do you think that Trump is going to be doing a great deal more economically while he nominally has the support of Congress, on the presumption that, every pundit on the planet, other than me actually, seems to think that it's determined that he's going to lose the midterms at the moment?
Well, I'm not a political prognosticator. Normally, the party that holds the White House will lose seats in the House and Senate during the midterm elections, but it doesn't always work that way. And, what is it that they say in, financial market commercials? Past performance is no guarantee of future performance, or something like that. So I have no idea what will happen in the midterm elections. The Republicans have a very narrow majority in the House of Representatives. And so I'm not surprised there are plenty of predictions that they'll lose control of the House. They have a 3-seat margin in the Senate, and the map, in terms of what Senate seats are up, the map seems to favor them. So there's a much higher likelihood of Republicans holding the Senate. I will say this: if they lose both the House and Senate, we'll probably have another impeachment vote, just because Democrats are so used to doing that. And Trump, of course, sometimes it almost seems like he wants to give them ammunition to do it, because he likes getting them all worked up. So we'll have lots and lots of political, silly, pointless battles if we have a Democratic Congress and Republican president after 2026. But in some sense, from a policy perspective, I mean, what is Donald Trump's economic agenda now? He's not really proposing any additional tax reforms. He'll probably continue to be sort of semi-weak on government spending. Hopefully there'll be some deregulation moving through the system. But there's really, we're almost, we got the so-called one big beautiful bill. I don't think there's going to be a major, other than whatever sort of random protectionist stuff he does, I don't think there's going to be a major economic agenda or legislative package that Trump is trying to get through. So almost by definition, if there's no economic agenda going on, it'll just be political fights.
So that is interesting, because I would agree with you. I mean, it seems to me there's not really a huge economic agenda going on in terms of what's happening at the moment. And that obviously has to be a bit of a concern for the rest of the world, because if our economic leadership in terms of radicalism is coming from Argentina, not a lot of people are going to pay attention to that. And at the same time, there seem to be, I don't want to say that I'm not going to talk the world into a recession, but there are certainly a lot of problems, ergo government debt in particular, out there that we need to reform. And yet there seems to be a paucity of people talking about reforming the economy.
Well, I want to emphasize something. If politicians in most of the world's advanced nations do not tackle their entitlement programs, the government-run healthcare systems, the pension programs, the welfare programs, the disability programs, if those programs are not fixed, there will be major debt crises. Now, let me emphasize something. The problem is government spending. The symptom of too much government spending is debt. But the debt in and of itself can cause a crisis when investors, like they did with Greece back in 2009, when investors think suddenly, well, I don't know that I trust this government to pay back its loans. That's when you have a so-called debt crisis where interest rates spike up. Financial systems oftentimes are hit by contagion because oftentimes because of government mandates, they hold a lot of government bonds. And it's not going to be limited to a few small countries. When you're talking major countries like France and Italy, the prospect of a serious fiscal crisis should be very, very sobering, because not only the crisis itself. But in all likelihood, what are these politicians going to do? They're going to say, let's raise taxes even further. Let's impose wealth taxes. Heck, they're pushing for a global wealth tax. So there are all sorts of really bad policy ideas out there. And the first instinct of politicians when the crisis happens, they're going to look up at the shelf of potential tax increases. Let's take these higher income tax rates. Let's take these value-added tax increases. Oh, and here's our wealth tax, which of course is what they've always wanted, is a big giant wealth tax. Ideally, through the OECD or something like that, or the IMF, they would want that harmonized throughout the entire world. And this is one of the reasons why I think Milei and what he's doing in Argentina, you're right, a lot of people don't pay much attention, but Milei is actually showing there is a real solution. It's spending restraint, because of course, higher taxes, that never works. Because what happens? The economy gets weaker. Politicians react to the thought of more money by increasing spending even further. And you simply wind up in this terrible cycle of more taxes, more spending, more debt, more taxes, more spending, more debt. And so I desperately want Javier Milei to have a good election, midterm election, October 26th, because if he can get through further reforms, he can show the entire world that there is a solution to the problem of too much government. And by the way, Patrick, I get asked all the time. I spoke earlier this year in China, in Hungary, and Estonia, just a couple of days ago in Mexico. Everyone asked me about Milei. The world is paying attention, at least sort of the policy wonks of the world are paying attention. And if Javier Milei can at least convince the so-called center-right parties of the world, instead of sort of having this appeasement, sort of soft big government mindset, if he can convince them to go back to a Reagan-Thatcher, more muscular agenda of limited government and free markets, I mean, I'm only slightly exaggerating when I say that Javier Milei may wind up saving the Western world.
That's a fascinating concept, that Argentina could come in and save the Western world. Let's face it, during World War II, there's a big argument for saying that in many ways they helped save the Western world then by being able to export a lot of beef and other great produce that managed to keep feeding people. So when we're looking at this, you mentioned how you're going around the world, you're meeting all sorts of interesting people. You mentioned Estonia, which is a very, very interesting experiment in economics in a very micro scale ongoing. How do you think there's a catalyst? Do you think that a debt crisis is the thing that may suddenly actually start to get people pushing back? And I mean, given the fact that I'm sitting here in Europe, and frankly, it scares the living daylights out of me to see the UK gilt market at its highest yield in 27, 28 years after entrenched appalling governments from nominally all sides of the political sphere. It's not really a political issue. And equally, as you say, I mean, France, Germany, both got huge debt problems. Italy's got a huge debt problem, but remarkably, the most stable prime minister in Europe, which I think has got to be the scariest thing to think about, given their post-war history. Do you think it's going to be that we have to have the catalyst of a crisis, even if it's a limited crisis in one or two countries?
Unfortunately, I think politicians, their first instinct is to first pretend a problem doesn't exist. And then if they're forced to acknowledge the problem, they want to postpone it, kick the can down the road, as we say in the United States. And only when the crisis really becomes serious, then they'll finally take action. And as I already warned, their first instinct is always, how can they grab more money from the productive sector of the economy with their grab bag of different tax increases, sort of like what most of them did back in the European debt crisis of 2009, 2010. Now, hopefully they learn something from those mistakes, and hopefully they're learning something from Javier Milei's great success. But when you look at the political control, who are the governments in places like France? There are no Javier Mileis in the French government. Keir Starmer in the United Kingdom. I mean, this guy is basically just a boring version of Jeremy Corbyn, I sometimes think. So I'm not confident when the crisis hits that many governments will do the right thing. Now, of course, the real solution is not to get in trouble in the first place. And that's why you look at a country like Estonia with its free market reforms after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Their debt levels are low. So when France and Italy and the UK blow up, Estonia will be in pretty good shape. And of course, we already talked about Switzerland being in very, very strong shape. So when you look at Europe, it's not just one blob. It's all sorts of different countries. And those countries are teaching us that if you control government spending and have a free market economy, you'll have good economic results, low levels of debt, and you won't have a crisis. But unfortunately, in Europe's big economies, it seems that, boy, the political situation is, I'll just leave it at this. It doesn't leave me reasons for optimism.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're with Dan Mitchell today. Fabulous discussion. We're talking about macroeconomics. We've been looking at Argentina. We're looking all the way around the world from the Washington, D.C. beltway out. I'm going to give Dan a rest for a couple of moments. Send us your questions, please, ladies and gentlemen, for this episode 183 from Washington, D.C. to Argentina, because it is a fabulous discussion. We'll be delighted to hear from you. Thank you very, very much. Let me also say Vanuma Balaji for saying hello to us. I'm glad that you are with us today, and thanks very much for joining this show. Let's take a quick break and look at a couple of things that we have been looking at different times on our agenda. And first of all, let's have a little short video about something that affects us all: money. Meanwhile, in big world, in case you missed it, Florida enacted over 120 new laws July. The first most interesting from the Sunshine State was, from a market's point of view at least, CSHB 999, which recognizes gold and silver as proper legal tender. Well, it's better than Bitcoin. For more in big world, like or follow. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, through the summer, Exchange Invest has, of course, been carrying on. Please do subscribe if you're interested in the world of market structure and all the related gubbins that go with that. Our book of the week, well, we'll be catching up over the course of the next few weeks. From the end of July, we had Lords of Finance, Leah Quad Ahmed's fantastic discussion of the Great Depression and the bankers who broke the world. Very interesting discussion of the relationships between all of them. Then the following week in mid-August, August 9th, we had Plumbers and Visionaries, Security Settlement and Europe's Financial Market by the great Peter Norman, who sadly is refusing to come on this show because he's claiming he's retired, but I still think he would have a great deal to add to the discussion. So don't forget to pick up a copy of those books anytime you get a chance, and let's roll back to the discussion with Dan Mitchell. If you've got any questions, ladies and gentlemen, we're delighted to hear from you. So, I mean, Dan, yeah, there's guarded optimism that Milei is going in the right direction. But I think one thing that does concern me is, you mentioned that all these conferences are going on. They're bringing you around as a speaker, amongst others. You're extolling the free market, free trade. I make a perfect admission. I'm a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of World Traders in the City of London. But it has to be said, I mean, under Starmer, nothing looks particularly good in that country. It does worry me a little, because do you see champions for these ideas beyond Milei's Argentina who are likely to be going into government? Because, as you rightly say, there's certainly none of them going to be trying to fight for the Elysee Palace in Paris in a couple of years' time.
Boy, that's a tough question, Patrick. I'll give you an anecdote to tell you how tough it is. In 2016, there was a libertarian running for president, Gary Johnson. And he got a little bit of attention because there was a lot of unpopularity with the choice of Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. But Gary Johnson committed what everyone thought was a gaffe, because he was asked by someone in the media, name a foreign leader you admire. And Gary Johnson couldn't come up with any answers. And I wrote a column saying, well, of course he couldn't come up with any answers, because unless you happen to know about Mart Laar in Estonia, and of course he wasn't even in office anymore at that time. I mean, back in 2016, there were not any, at least from a libertarian, classical liberal perspective, there were no admirable foreign leaders. And now there is one of them, Javier Milei. Yeah. Now, I'm sure that whoever the rotating president of Switzerland is probably a sensible person. I'm sure whoever happens to be the prime minister of Estonia is probably a sensible person. But it is very unfortunate that, looking around the world, you don't have a lot of success stories. I mean, yeah, Singapore is a market economy that's gotten very rich. But, everyone said, oh, that's just a small, economy, so that doesn't count. And of course, Hong Kong before Beijing crackdown was a great story, but people said, oh, it didn't count because it was just a small little speck of land. So we really need more Ronald Reagans and Margaret Thatchers to come around, and maybe Milei will cause. There'll be a positive contagion effect if he convinces other center-right politicians to do the right thing. Because that, and this is probably a worthwhile thing to talk about, Patrick. Mm-hmm. I expect that among Christian Democrats in Germany, among the Tories in the United Kingdom, and you go around the world and look at center-right parties, I bet a lot of them privately sort of know, boy, it'd be good for our country. We'd be better off. It would be the right thing to do to shrink government and lower taxes. Oh, but I'm afraid to do it because maybe voters will kick me out because special interest groups are so strong. If Milei shows that you can do the right thing and be politically popular by doing the right thing, maybe, just maybe, that will lead to a backbone infusion among politicians elsewhere in the world that privately understand he's doing the right thing in Argentina, but they're afraid to try to do the same thing in their own countries. I mean, think about it. Reagan and Thatcher are what? Now, we're now talking, almost 50 years ago. Reagan and Thatcher showed the world that an agenda of free markets and limited government boosted prosperity. And we did have this period of time for about 20 years called the Washington Consensus, when there was a lot of liberalization going on around the world. Other countries were copying Thatcher and Reagan by slashing tax rates and doing other pro-market reforms. So I'm just keeping my fingers crossed. We need another revolution in terms of free markets and limited government, because if you look at the demographics, and this is something that's built in, we know it's happening. We know we're living longer. We know we're having fewer children. A modest-sized welfare state, when there was a population pyramid, was mathematically feasible. Not what I would have wanted, but it was mathematically feasible. Well, now that we're moving from a population pyramid to a population cylinder, with more old people and fewer young people, and of course the young people are the future workers and taxpayers, you can't have the massive welfare states that we have today. Otherwise, there'll be economic crisis, economic collapse, and just terrible consequences for the world, because you could bail out Greece in 2009, 2010. It was a tiny economy compared to the world. If Italy and France or the United Kingdom are going belly up, and heaven protect us from the U.S. doing the same thing, because we're heading down that path as well. I mean, it could really be terrible economic consequences in our lifetimes.
It's a colossal series of things to unpack there. And I mean, certainly you're absolutely right about the 1980s. I mean, I think also of the kind of holy trinity we had, because you had Reagan, you had Thatcher, and in the middle, well, at least slightly further to the east, you had Pope John Paul II. I got to mention him today as I'm in Warsaw, Poland, because what he did in funneling cash in order to essentially break down the whole of the Soviet bloc and the Warsaw Pact was a phenomenal achievement that nobody believed could happen just years before we ended up at the Gdansk round table talks, and then ultimately the Berlin Wall falling apart later in 1989, and the whole 1990 experience. It's fascinating. And as you say, if people can see that they're going to win electorally, that might be the thing to push them around. I must say it's very worrying at the moment because there's such a lack of candidates. Fabulous question has come in. I'm going to move slightly the cadence of where we are. Anne Berg, our commodity doyen, and I hope you don't mind outing you, Anne, but I do believe you're a bit of a fangirl for Javier Milei as well. She's saying, most fascinating, the world sits up and takes note of the mercurial Milei. Dan, do you have an opinion of a possible U.S. minerals trade deal with Argentina?
I am a policy wonk, not an investment guru. So I'm not going to pretend to know which of the many deals that Milei is signing, which ones are good and which ones will make a big difference. I know that there's sort of an endless series of news. Investors around the world are noticing that Argentina is doing these reforms. There's a lot of enthusiasm about investing in Argentina. But in terms of details, I'm sure there are many, many people more qualified than me. I give boring talks about economic policy. I'm not in the world, unfortunately, of actually making money.
So let's widen that out a bit. But when you look at sort of economic policy, how do you see the way in which economic policy can be used to improve trade in things like minerals and other related issues? Because obviously we've ended up down this crazy rabbit hole where everybody believes that there's a scarcity. I mean, they even put the name rare in front of rare earths when they're actually not that rare. I mean, they're difficult to find, but they are in existence. Are there ways here where we can help reshape the economies and therefore help the Milei agenda as well as other agendas around the world?
Oh, well, there's no question that some of the things Milei is doing are directly connected to the fact that there are now all these economic deals, all these new investments pouring into the country. Most importantly, he's getting rid of all sorts of just ridiculous permits and rules and restrictions that made it difficult to bring in machinery and equipment and technology, and most importantly, by fixing the financial system, controlling government spending, eliminating budget deficits, and in effect freeing up the currency. Milei has made it possible for companies not only to make money in Argentina, but then to take the money out of Argentina when it's time to pay off shareholders and bondholders. So a lot of Milei's economic reforms are very tangibly and directly connected to the fact that international investors, multinationals, and others see Argentina as a much better place to invest than they did just a couple of years ago, because the Peronists had made it such a nightmare where, okay, maybe you could get money in, albeit in a very expensive way, but you couldn't get money out. And so I completely applaud what Milei is doing. He understands that inward investment is a great shortcut to making an economy richer. And I'm not surprised we're seeing all these projects being announced and being undertaken. I just don't happen to be an expert on the business side of it.
No, that's fine. It's absolutely fine. And I think it's a very interesting point you make, though. It strikes me that a couple of things that are vitally important is you must be able to get your money in and get your money out. The second thing is the body of law that's behind it. One of the problems I saw in Argentina in recent years was because they were using a kind of Hispanic and therefore Roman law-based system, that in itself can present some problems where Anglo-Saxon common law can be really good. To wit, when you go to try to buy yourself a house or an apartment in Buenos Aires, the property canon isn't actually very well organized. Now, that even predates the Peronistas. I mean, that's something that's been going on for centuries, whereas you look at offbeat places like the former Yugoslavia, which is actually incredibly well organized, despite the fact that they had Tito and socialism for 30 odd years. Or to be fair, somewhere like the USA and the United Kingdom, where you've pretty much got 100% likelihood that as long as you go through the paperwork right, when you buy yourself a piece of property, you know that you own it and you aren't going to be subject to many dubious claims.
I'm a big believer that the common law system is one of the great advantages of the Anglosphere, the United Kingdom and all its spin-off countries like the United States. As a matter of fact, that there's a tech guy in San Francisco, John Chisholm, who's writing a book about how the common law is a great economic advantage for the countries that have it. You should have him on as a guest. I think your listeners and viewers will be very fascinated by some of his insights.
That sounds fantastic, actually. He would build beautifully on one of our previous guests. We had Barney Reynolds, who himself wrote the common law system of law for the Abu Dhabi Financial Center so that they could integrate into the world's financial centers effortlessly and appear legally as if they're just... That's a very, very interesting point, and I'm glad to hear that we're agreed on common law. So when you look at what's going on at the moment, are there any particular spots in the US policy agenda that, beyond the debt and the spending, that particularly concern you at the moment?
The number one concern, obviously, is trade. It's not just that Trump is dramatically increasing trade taxes. He's doing it in a way where he's creating a lot of economic uncertainty, not to mention the fact that there are legal cases where his ability to just unilaterally impose these trade taxes may be thrown out by the courts. As a matter of fact, I'll predict that ultimately the Supreme Court will rule that he's misusing the IEPA legislation. But unfortunately, there are other laws, and I fully expect if Trump loses before the Supreme Court, he'll just turn around and unilaterally impose trade taxes using other laws. And then, of course, you have to start the whole legal process all over again. But while that's happening, all the people all around the world, importers, exporters, workers, consumers, companies, you name it, everyone is sort of maybe not frozen in place, but there's this massive uncertainty tax on top of the trade taxes, and he's definitely throwing sand in the gears of the global economy. And it's just unfortunate. He really seems to believe that trade is bad.
Yeah, although, I mean, to be fair on a certain level, I mean, the USA has been incredibly indulgent of a lot of other economies by allowing the Europeans and so on to have much higher level of tariffs for American goods going there than coming in. I'm not sure I necessarily disagree with that part of his equation, but I'm with you in the idea that certainly it seems sometimes that he thinks everything must be made in America, which seems to disregard a couple of hundred years of economic theory that other people were writing.
Well, if you look at his so-called Liberation Day tariffs, the original excuse we got was, oh, these are going to be reciprocal tariffs. And then it turns out that the U.S. is imposing much higher trade taxes in other countries than they ever imposed on the U.S. I mean, one of his highest protectionist trade taxes was 39% on Switzerland. And Switzerland basically has what, 0.5% average tariff on U.S. On imports from the United States. So Trump doesn't understand trade. It's really that simple. I'm glad that he hasn't decided to impose trade barriers between American states, because if his thinking is really bad on cross international border trade, well, logically, he should also be against cross national intra-national border trade. So maybe I shouldn't even say that out loud, just in case he accidentally hears our discussion.
But it is interesting. I mean, you're absolutely right, because certainly there are a lot of things in New York and his original tri-state area, let alone Florida, where he tends to be living, or at least I would presume will be living once he leaves Washington, D.C. once again, that, have remarkable economic imbalances with the rest of the USA. That's a fascinating point. It was really interesting what you were talking about earlier as well, and lengthy answer, and you unpacked beautifully between population pyramids and, as you call them, population cylinders, because certainly there are countries with great population pyramids, but somehow or other I can't quite see that the Democratic Republic of the Congo is going to come to the rescue of the global economy anytime in the near future. Bless them, and great work that they're doing to try and advance their own economy, but it's simply not going to be sufficient to manage to move forward. And I suppose that leads us to the interesting point about somewhere like China. I mean, it is a fascinating point in, ignore the politics if you can, but the economics of China look fascinating to me right at the moment. Their population is aging. They have got an incredible advantage in certain areas of production. They've got an amazing workforce still, at least for the time being, even though it may shrink in the near future. But nonetheless, they're suffering again from a kind of political malaise at the top, because they've got a political leader who, unlike Deng Xiaoping, doesn't really believe in trade.
Well, actually, I think President Xi believes in trade, but he doesn't believe in free markets.
Right.
And China has been backsliding toward more statism, and I think it's hurting them. Their industrial policy, they're sort of, it's watered down central planning compared to the terrible Mao era, but it's still central planning. Their financial system is very cronyist based, where you have to be friends of the Central Party Committee to get credit allocations and things like that. I'm worried about China, because the demographic decline is definitely there. But China has the capacity to be a very rich, productive country, but the political leaders have to be willing to let go of the economy. They have to be willing to just let private markets flourish. And I'm afraid that they're moving in the wrong direction. And I don't see any reason for optimism in the near term, at least, that there's going to be a second wave of liberalization like there was in the 80s and 90s.
No, that's an interesting point. Although I would probably split hairs a little bit with you, because I think a lot of people have been very down on Hong Kong of late. And I appreciate the Hong Kong of today is not the Hong Kong of 25, 30 years ago. But nonetheless, that does still strike me as an incredibly dynamic economic trade entrepot in a way that a lot of parts of the rest of the world just aren't. And let's face it, they've still got a remarkably low tax base and a lot of incentives if you do well.
Hong Kong used to be the sort of gold standard for economic liberty. And you're right, the tax system hasn't been ruined just because Beijing has sort of cracked down on civil liberties. But if you look at investment flows, I think Hong Kong is beginning to suffer. There's a growing gap between Singapore and Hong Kong. Those used to be the two competing free market city states of Asia, and a lot of maybe not a lot, but a significant amount of economic activity has migrated from Hong Kong to Singapore. So by world standards, Hong Kong still has an awful lot of economic freedom, but I don't think there's the confidence in the future that's necessary for sort of long-run investments and long-run economic growth. I hope I'm wrong. Like all economists, I'm sure I am wrong many, many times. But boy, I'd love to see Hong Kong go back to the sort of total freedom that it had 10 years ago.
That would certainly be a very, very interesting proposition altogether, Dan. And look, I mean, thank you so much for what has been an incredibly interesting discussion. We've been here talking all the way from, well, actually, we've done a tour de table of most of the world, but we started from Washington, D.C., and we worked our way to Miles, Argentina, and many other places in between. It only remains for me to ask you that one key question we ask all of our guests. Dan Mitchell, where do you think the capital market revolution goes next?
Unfortunately, I think the biggest thing to look at in capital markets is the danger of another European-style debt crisis. If, heaven forbid, there's any sort of global recession, I would be stunned if it didn't wind up producing a debt crisis. France, Italy, maybe even the United Kingdom. I mean, so many of these countries are in just very difficult shape because of their demographics and their structure of their governments, with just too much of the economy being diverted into political control. And that's what makes me very, very nervous in the long run. And for all I know, the long run might only be a year or two away. I hope we have a lot more time than that. But like I said, the moment there's some sort of hiccup in the global economy, I'm going to be very, very nervous about what's going to happen with some of these European welfare states that have refused to take seriously their fiscal situations.
There you go, ladies and gentlemen. It's not going to be a question of, well, it's a question of, I suppose, debt, Cluedo. It's not whether it was Colonel Mustard with the iron bar in the conservatory, but it's actually a question of who's going to be the person whose debt mountain causes the death in the first place. Now, one thing we haven't done today, and I'm so sorry, Dan, I meant to talk to you about it earlier, but I just want to highlight, you have a fantastic book out. It's a really, really gripping read. It's most interesting to see altogether. I do believe we've got a cover of it somewhere about to appear on thing, talking about the greatest Ponzi scheme, how the US can avoid economic collapse. I think probably we can all deploy our intuition to get an idea of some of the stuff we've been talking about here, but actually come back some other time and let's talk more directly about your book. It would be great to have you back on the show. I've thoroughly enjoyed this opportunity to re-energize IPO-VID after the summer break. Thank you very, very much to our other interlocutors, Vanumu Balaji and Anne Berg. Thank you for those great questions. Thank you to our fabulous production team, Desiree, Janella, and Racy. This has been IPO-VID 183. We are all together, united, I think, waiting for, when's that date? October the 26th, right? The midterms in Argentina, going to be a very, very important day for life, liberty, and the pursuit of economic happiness throughout the world, ladies and gentlemen. Dan Mitchell from Washington, D.C. to the Argentine hinterlands. Thank you very much for joining IPO-VID. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you all a great week in life and markets. Next week, slightly different change of pace. We're going to be talking about banking on your neighbor with the entirely beguiling and brilliant Melissa Dorman. Catch us same time next week.